Jacqueline Harold Lucas was born on February 14, 1928, Valentine's Day. If life had a sense of irony, it was that a boy born on a day for love would come to embody raw, unflinching violence in service of his brothers. But there was no sentimentality in Plymouth, North Carolina, not in the waning days of the Great Depression, and definitely not in Jack's world. His father died while Jack was still a boy. The cause, rarely discussed, didn't matter as much as the aftermath. Jack was left with a hole in his life and a young mother trying to keep the household stitched together. In that part of the South, men died, women persevered, and kids grew up fast, or didn't grow up at all. Jack wasn't the kind to sit still, not then, not ever. He was trouble, not the kind you whisper about at church, but the kind that makes teachers resign and neighbors reinforce their fences. Even before he hit his teens, Jack had a reputation, a stocky little powder keg with a fuse made of pride and fists. If someone challenged him, he swung. If someone gave him an order, he ignored it, or found a way to one-up it. Rules for Jack were just slower ways to get things done. His mother, overwhelmed and pragmatic, shipped him off to Edwards Military Institute, a prep school with a reputation for breaking boys down and building soldiers up. The staff assumed Jack was another rebellious orphan in need of discipline. What they got instead was a brawler with a chip on his shoulder and a shocking capacity for pain. Jack didn't just survive Edwards, he treated it like a proving ground. He lifted weights until his shoulders looked carved from railroad ties. He boxed with older boys and broke noses more often than he bloodied his own. Instructors learned quickly that punishment wasn't deterrent, it was fuel. If you made Jack do push-ups, he did double. If you yelled in his face, he stared you down like you owed him money. He topped out at 5'8", but built his body like a bulldog's, compact, dense, and indestructible. Classmates remember a kid who didn't talk much about feelings or dreams. What he talked about was war. Not in the abstract, not like boys playing army in the backyard. Jack talked about fighting in the Pacific, about rifles and bayonets and Marines. Always the Marines. Why the Corps? Maybe it was the uniforms, those crisp blues, clean lines, the undeniable sense of belonging. Maybe it was the stories from old-timers in town, World War I vets who'd seen bellow wood and wore their scars like medals. Or maybe Jack just sensed that the Marine Corps was the one place on Earth where his stubborn, combative nature might actually be useful instead of destructive. He memorized everything about the service, its history, its slogans, its heroes. He studied their battles like scripture. By age 12, Jack could list every major Marine campaign from Belleau Wood to Guadalcanal. He knew the standard issue rifle, the field rations, the drill cadence. He wasn't preparing for war, he was expecting it. By the time he hit 13, most boys his age were discovering baseball or comic books. Jack was shadow boxing in alleyways and doing pull-ups off barn rafters. When he couldn't find a sparring partner, he punched trees. When he got detention, he ran laps afterwards, shirtless, in winter, grinning like he had something to prove. And he did. What he didn't have was patience, not for high school, not for waiting until he turned 18, certainly not for playing by anyone else's timeline. The war was raging overseas. American boys were storming beaches and taking shrapnel in places Jack could only trace with a map and a clenched jaw. Every casualty report in the newspaper was another reason Jack felt like he was wasting time. So he made up his mind. At 14, Jack Lucas decided that the only thing standing between him and a rifle was a lie, a forged birth certificate, a deepened voice, and a recruiter desperate enough to ignore the obvious. It wasn't as rare as it should have been. Desperate times make for lazy paperwork, and Jack looked the part, muscled, broad, angry, the kind of kid who didn't ask to be tested, just handed a weapon and pointed at the enemy. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, because the Jack who walked into the recruiting station at 14 was more than just a determined boy. He was the product of loss, of hardship, of a country at war and a culture that romanced violence in uniform. He wasn't running away from anything. He was running straight into the furnace, convinced that fire would make him something more than a misfit. What's striking in hindsight is how inevitable it all feels. Jack wasn't steered towards war. He sprinted towards it. Headlong, bare-knuckled, without hesitation. And everyone around him, his teachers, his mother, his fellow students, had this unspoken understanding. He was going to find his way into the fight, one way or another. Some kids want to be soldiers. Jack Lucas wanted to be a Marine. Not when he grew up, right then. And the world was about to find out what happens when a boy who refuses to be told no decides the battlefield is where he belongs. In 1942, the United States Marine Corps was a different beast than it is today. The Corps was expanding fast, desperate for bodies to hurl into the Pacific meat grinder. Recruiters were overworked, underpaid, and not exactly known for their attention to detail. For a 14-year-old with muscles like cinder blocks and a chip on his shoulder the size of a howitzer shell, that was a golden opportunity. Jack Lucas didn't ask for permission. He forged his mother's signature, fudged his birthday by 3 years, and marched into the recruiter's office like he owned the place. His voice hadn't even fully settled into baritone, but he deepened it with every syllable. He probably stood on his toes. He definitely flexed, and it worked. The recruiter looked him over, thick neck, broad shoulders, no-nonsense eyes, and figured, good enough. Maybe this guy was behind on his quota. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he looked at Jack and thought, hell, this kid might actually make it. Whatever the reason, Jack Lucas got the stamp, got the papers, got a rifle, and got on a bus to Parris Island. Parris Island, South Carolina, legendary for transforming cocky kids into lethal Marines. For Jack, it was paradise. While most recruits arrived scared, homesick, and unprepared, Jack showed up like a caged animal finally let loose. He didn't just want the smoke, he was the smoke. Boot camp wasn't a challenge for Jack, it was a checklist. Drill instructors screamed, Jack didn't flinch. Forced marches, he carried his pack like it weighed nothing. Obstacle courses, he attacked them like they owed him money. Where others struggled, Jack thrived. He wasn't the best recruit on paper. His attitude was still a mess. But when it came to grit, pain tolerance, and raw aggression, Jack was already 10 steps ahead. The DIs had a problem. They couldn't break him. They could punish him, sure. He spent more than a few nights doing push-ups in the mud or cleaning latrines with a toothbrush, but he never cracked, never complained, and he liked it. That was the worst part. Pain just made him smile harder. By the end of training, Jack stood a little straighter, not much taller, he was still 5'8", but now he carried himself like a man with nothing to prove and everything to fight for. He graduated as a private, barely old enough to get a learner's permit back home, but now an official United States Marine. Then came the assignment, Hawaii. Jack was shipped to the Pacific Theater, but not to the front. Instead, they stuck him with a rear echelon role, driving trucks, hauling gear, babysitting logistics. To most guys, this was a dream assignment. Beaches, warm weather, relatively low risk. But to Jack, it was a prison. He didn't enlist to move crates. He wanted to kill Japs. He wanted to storm beaches, fire his rifle, and bleed if that's what it took. But the Corps had found out something Jack hadn't counted on, his real age. Turns out, forged signatures don't hold up when your mother writes a letter to the Marine Corps saying, "Excuse me, have you seen my 14-year-old son?" That letter landed on someone's desk and suddenly there were questions, real questions. Not enough to boot Jack entirely, by that point he'd already earned his stripes, but enough to yank him from the deployment list. So they grounded him, kept him off the boats, no combat assignments, no frontline duties, just maintenance work, perimeter security, and worst of all, orders to wait. For Jack, that was worse than death. He tried to convince the officers to let him fight, pleaded, argued, even tried to pick fights just to get noticed. Nothing worked. The Corps wasn't ready to hand a rifle to a 15-year-old, no matter how many push-ups he could do. But Jack Lucas wasn't built to wait. So one day, he just walked off base, packed a duffel, snuck past the MPs, and disappeared into the Pacific night like a ghost with a grudge. His destination? The front. Somehow, someway, he was going to get back in the fight. It was the kind of move that would get most Marines court-martialed. Jack didn't care. He wasn't trying to preserve a spotless record. He was trying to prove something to himself, to the Corps, to the war itself. In his mind, he was already dead. The only question was how useful he could be before the bullet found him. He hitchhiked, stowed away, scrounged rations, and snuck aboard a troop transport ship headed for Iwo Jima. Slept in the shadows, survived on scraps, and waited for the right moment to reveal himself, far enough at sea that they couldn't turn back. When he finally emerged and turned himself in, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for a rifle. To their credit, the officers didn't throw him in the brig. Maybe they were too stunned. Maybe they saw the fire in his eyes. Maybe they figured that if a kid was crazy enough to sneak his way into hell, he might just belong there. So they reassigned him to the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, 5th Marine Division. Combat infantry, the real deal. Jack Lucas had finally gotten what he wanted, a chance to die for something that mattered. He was 15. If the Marine Corps wasn't going to send Jack Lucas to war, then Jack Lucas would take himself there. It wasn't a tantrum, it wasn't rebellion, it was, in Jack's mind, simple math. His country was fighting, his brothers were dying, and he was sitting on an island polishing a truck bumper. That wasn't service, that was prison. So he packed a bag, stole rations, slipped past base security, and walked off. Going AWOL in the middle of a war was no small thing. If he'd been caught, Jack could have faced prison time, hard time. But the rules never held much sway over him, especially when they clashed with what he believed was right. And Jack believed, with every fiber of his being, that he belonged in the fight. His plan wasn't complicated, just dangerous. He hitchhiked across the island, slept rough, ate what he could scrounge, and tracked down a staging port where Marines were boarding ships bound for Iwo Jima. These weren't recruits anymore. These were grizzled men gearing up for the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific to date. Jack, still technically 15, blended in by sheer force of will. He snuck aboard a transport ship, records suggest it may have been the USS Duel, and hid deep in the hold. No ID, no gear manifest, just a rifle, a bedroll, and enough nerve to make most grown men hesitate. Days passed. Jack rationed what little food he'd stuffed into his pack, drank condensation from pipes, and stayed out of sight. The ship groaned and lurched its way into the open Pacific, carrying thousands of Marines toward the volcanic fortress of Iwo Jima. By the time Jack revealed himself, they were too far at sea to turn back. He walked topside, reported to the nearest sergeant, and declared himself ready for duty. They could have thrown him in the brig, they could have reported him, had him sent back in disgrace. But instead, someone looked at this kid with the eyes of a brawler and the scars of 100 fights and said, "Screw it, hand him a rifle." The front lines have always had a strange pragmatism to them. In the rear, you get red tape. At the front, you get results. Jack didn't need to prove he could handle himself. The way he carried that M1 Garand, like it was welded to his chest, did all the talking. He was folded into the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, 5th Marine Division. No more logistics, no more rear echelon chores. Now he was in the infantry, the tip of the spear. His squad mates were older, harder, already baptized by fire. Most of them were in their 20s, veterans of Bougainville, Guam, or Paleo. But they knew a killer when they saw one. Jack was short, square, and intense, like a stick of dynamite with a haircut. Once they got over the shock of his age, they started to trust him fast. He trained with them, cleaned weapons with them, gambled with them, and when the time came, he climbed into the landing craft with them. There was no announcement, no moment where Jack was formally welcomed back into the Corps' good graces. It wasn't necessary. He'd proved more with that single act of desertion than most men did in a full enlistment. Somewhere in the records, a paper trail must exist. A reprimand, a warning, maybe a note scribbled by an officer wondering what to do with a teenage stowaway who refused to stay safe. But none of it mattered on the eve of Iwo Jima. Jack had done the impossible. Not because he was special, not because he had a death wish, but because he simply refused to be left behind. It's hard to explain the psychology of someone like Jack. Most men go to war reluctantly. Even those who volunteer often find themselves second-guessing, hesitating in quiet moments. Jack had none of that. He chased the war like it owed him something. He didn't talk much about it, not even later in life. When asked, he'd just shrug and say, "I couldn't let them go without me." As if sneaking aboard a combat ship was the logical thing to do. As if jumping headfirst into one of the bloodiest battles in American history was just another chore he needed to check off. His unit began briefing for the Iwo Jima landing. Maps were unrolled, terrain models built from sand and wax. The intelligence was good. No one had precise numbers on how many Japanese were dug in on the island's rock. But the general consensus was this: it would be bad. Jack didn't flinch. He sat in those briefings, just another face in the crowd. Maybe he asked questions, maybe he didn't. But he listened, took notes, cleaned his rifle, checked his gear. He was ready to go. One sergeant years later said of Jack, "We knew he wasn't old enough to vote, but he fought like he didn't expect to see tomorrow, and somehow that made him one of us." It wasn't long now. The beachhead at Iwo Jima loomed just over the horizon, and Jack Lucas, the runaway, the underage grunt, the Marine who wouldn't take no for an answer, was right where he wanted to be, locked and loaded with a rifle in his hands. On February 19, 1945, Jack Lucas climbed down the side of a troop transport and into a bobbing Higgins boat with the rest of his unit. Steel helmet strapped down, M1 Garand across his chest, boots soaked, heart pounding, not with fear, but with purpose. They called it D-Day for Iwo Jima, and it was every bit as bad as it sounded. The beach itself was a nightmare, black volcanic ash that swallowed your boots like wet cement. No cover, no concealment, just an open expanse of hell with Japanese machine guns dug into Mount Suribachi, waiting to reap souls. The island looked small from a distance. Up close, it was a death trap. Jack's landing craft bucked in the surf as shells exploded around them, geysers of salt water and metal. Men vomited from nerves and diesel fumes. Some crossed themselves. Jack just stared forward, jaw clenched. He wasn't there to pray. He was there to fight. When the ramp dropped, chaos poured in. Marines hit the beach under withering fire. MGs from hidden bunkers raked the sand. Mortars screamed in. Bodies fell. The sand turned red before most men had even cleared the surf. Jack moved like a man possessed. He shoved forward, slipping and scrambling through the ash. The Garand felt heavy but familiar. He found cover behind a shallow dune, caught his breath, then sprinted to the next position. There was no time to think, only to move. The air stank of cordite and burning flesh. Screams cut through the din, wounded Marines, men yelling for medics, NCOs trying to rally their squads. The Japanese weren't fighting from the beach like at Tarawa. They were buried deep, bunkers, tunnels, spider holes, turning the whole island into a fortress. Jack's squad pressed inland. They weren't tasked with seizing territory. They were sent to root out resistance. That meant clearing caves, flushing bunkers with grenades, and fighting at distances so close you could smell the enemy's breath before you saw his face. They fought for hours, maybe days. It all bled together. Sleep came in stolen moments behind rubble. Meals were cold rations eaten between bursts of fire. No one took off their boots. No one looked too far ahead. Iwo Jima was a meat grinder. You didn't plan on surviving. You just tried not to stop moving. Jack didn't distinguish himself through heroics, at least not yet. He was just relentless. Where others hesitated, he charged. When someone needed to take point, Jack volunteered. He didn't act fearless, he was fearless. He moved with controlled fury, checking corners, listening for telltale clatter of movement in the rock, firing without hesitation when a figure twitched wrong. He fought with the intensity of a man who'd been waiting his whole life for this moment, because he had. There's a detail that gets lost in the history books. Jack didn't even have to be there. He could have stayed safe, Could have been court-martialed and sent home. But he chose this. He chose Iwo. He chose the front, the blood, the pain. And now, elbow deep in volcanic sand and war, he was proving why. By the third day, Jack's unit had pushed into the heart of Japanese resistance. They fought through ravines choked with debris and the dead. Cave mouths loomed like portals to the underworld. Marines cleared them with flamethrowers and grenades. The heat of the smoke so intense it singed eyebrows and left ears ringing. Jack kept pushing. No complaints, no hesitation, just movement. On February 20th, his squad was assigned to sweep a series of interconnected trenches near a ravine. The terrain was jagged, full of blind corners, perfect for ambushes. Everyone was tense. Every step could trigger an explosion or a gunfight. They moved low, rifles up, eyes sharp. Jack was near the front of the patrol. His boots crunched over ash and shattered stone. Somewhere ahead, the machine gun rattled, then silence. The squad halted. Whispers passed, orders exchanged. They moved again, this time tighter and closer. Jack gritted his teeth. He could feel it in his bones. Something was about to happen. And he was right. They rounded a bend in the ravine and walked straight into it. A squad of Japanese soldiers, dug in and waiting. The ambush was instant. Grenades flew, gunfire erupted, chaos. And in that moment, 1 second, maybe less, Jack Lucas made a decision that would etch his name into Marine Corps history forever. It happened fast, too fast for thinking, too fast for anything except raw instinct. Jack and his fire team were moving through a trench near the base of a ridge when the Japanese opened up from a hidden position. A shout, a burst of fire, a hail of fragmentation. 2 grenades landed at their feet. One bounced off a wall and dropped right between them. The second clinked just behind. There was no time to shout, no time to run, no time to even curse. Jack Lucas didn't hesitate, not for a second. He screamed a warning, shoved the first grenade into the volcanic ash, and threw himself on top of it. A moment later, he spotted the second grenade and, God knows how, reached back, grabbed it, and pulled it underneath his body too. 2 live grenades, 1 17-year-old Marine. He curled his stocky frame over both, arms pressed down, body braced, and waited. The explosions ripped through him like lightning through a tree. One went off directly beneath his torso, the other under his arm. Flesh shredded, steel fragments tore into his ribs, his jaw, his stomach, his inner thighs. Blood sprayed the walls of the trench. Smoke and dirt blew skyward in a thunderclap of force. And Jack Lucas, somehow, did not die. His squad hit the ground, expecting to be vaporized. When the smoke cleared, they turned and saw a pile of torn uniform and bloodied limbs twitching in the dirt. Jack was still alive, but just barely. His first words, mumbled through a mouthful of blood and shattered teeth, were, "I'm still here." Then he passed out. The squad snapped into action. 1 Marine provided cover, another grabbed Jack under the arms, a third radioed for an evac team. There were still Japanese firing from somewhere behind the rocks, but no one was going to let this kid die alone. They dragged him to cover, wrapped him in whatever rags and gauze they had, and waited. Jack faded in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he talked, sometimes he screamed, sometimes he was dead silent. At one point, the corpsman leaned in to check his pulse and whispered, "This one's not gonna make it." Jack heard that. He always remembered it. His reply, slurred and faint, was something like hell I'm not. The medics hauled him down to the beach, jostling his broken frame over every rock and shell crater along the way. He never once asked to stop. He was loaded onto a hospital ship and wheeled straight into emergency surgery. Over the following days and weeks, Jack Lucas underwent 21 separate operations. They pulled 250 pieces of metal from his body, shards of grenade casings, bits of stone, even splitters from his own bone. Around 200 more fragments remained lodged in his muscles and organs for life. Doctors were stunned he'd survived the first hour, let alone the first day. No one survives 2 grenades at point-blank range. It wasn't just improbable, It was obscene, but Jack was too stubborn to die. His jaw was wired shut, his intestines stitched and restitched. His body was a road map of scars and steel. He couldn't walk for weeks, could barely sit upright without blacking out, but he kept living, kept healing. Word of what happened spread quickly. Marines told the story in hushed tones, passing it along like legend. A kid, 17 max, jumped on 2 grenades and lived? Couldn't be true. Had to be a myth. But it wasn't. When Jack could finally speak again, reporters tried to get a quote from him. Something inspirational, something heroic. All he said was, "I saw my buddies were about to die, so I did something about it." That was it. No speech, no drama, just a simple truth, delivered like it was the most obvious decision in the world. Later, the paperwork began to move. His chain of command filed the necessary reports, documented the wounds, took eyewitness statements. The Medal of Honor process is never fast, but in Jack's case, it was practically urgent, because no one thought he'd survive long enough to receive it. But Jack kept breathing, kept fighting infections, kept learning to walk again, and by the end of 1945, he was strong enough to stand on his own, shaky, thin, but upright. The Marine Corps knew what it had on its hands, a living legend, a walking reminder of what the word sacrifice actually meant, and soon the White House came calling. Jack Lucas had earned the nation's highest military honor, not just with courage, not just with instinct, but with a kind of selfless, brutal love that only exists between men who've bled together. On the battlefield, Jack didn't think about medals. He didn't think about history. He thought about the guys beside him. And in that moment, he decided that his life was worth less than theirs. That wasn't just bravery. That was love. That was war. And that was Jack Lucas. Jack Lucas wasn't supposed to live, not by any medical standard, not by common sense, not by even the most optimistic field surgeon. He jumped on 2 grenades. That's not a story you live to tell. That's the end of the movie. But for Jack Lucas, it was only the intermission. They brought him into the hospital ship in pieces, literally. His torso had been opened by the blast, his arms shredded, his jaw broken, face swollen beyond recognition. A corpsman later described him as a sack of hamburger that kept breathing. The first surgery was just to keep him alive. They stabilized what they could, removed the most dangerous fragments, and closed the wounds enough to stop the worst bleeding. They didn't think he'd make it through the night. He did. The next day brought more surgery, then another. The medical staff worked in shifts, treating him like a miracle already in motion. His pulse dipped, his breathing stuttered, but somehow, every time they thought he was slipping away, he rallied. They called him the kid who wouldn't die. Jack drifted in and out of consciousness. His memories of those days were foggy. Flashes of white ceilings, the smell of alcohol and iodine, the low hum of generators, nurses whispering over his bed. He hallucinated, dreamed of the beach, of fire and sand and screaming. Woke up screaming himself more than once. He didn't know what day it was, didn't know if the war was over, didn't know if the other Marines had made it out. But he knew one thing, he was still alive. And if he was alive, he damn well wasn't going to waste it. The surgeries continued, 21 in total over the following months. Some were life-saving, others reconstructive. Doctors pulled shrapnel from his chest, his lungs, his face. Tiny fragments of steel had lodged in places they couldn't even find at first. Near arteries, in soft tissue, embedded in muscle and bone. Not all of it came out. In the end, more than 200 pieces of metal remained in Jack's body. Some as small as pencil shavings, others the size of coins. He carried them like souvenirs. One fragment was lodged so close to his heart that removing it would have killed him, so they left it in. He never stopped healing, never stopped hurting either. The pain was constant, white-hot flares in his abdomen, stabbing jolts when he moved the wrong way, migraines that made him feel like he was back in the blast crater. And then there was the itching, the maddening sensation of nerves misfiring as skin and scar tissue tried to reconnect. Still, Jack didn't complain, not once. The nurses noticed it first. No moaning, no self-pity, just gritted teeth and clenched fists. He endured it like he endured everything else, on principle. One corpsman asked him how the hell he wasn't screaming. Jack said, "What good would it do?" Rehabilitation was slow. Jack had to learn to sit up without blacking out, then to stand, then to walk. The first time he put weight on his legs, he collapsed. Not because the bones were broken, they weren't, but because his muscles had wasted away to almost nothing. He pushed through. By the end of 1945, Jack Lucas could walk unassisted. He was thinner, weaker, but not broken, never broken. The war ended before Jack left the hospital. He missed the surrender ceremonies, the parades, the homecoming celebrations. He watched the headlines from a hospital bed and didn't care. His war had ended in a trench with 2 grenades. The rest was just paperwork. When he was finally discharged from medical care, Jack wasn't handed a medal. Not yet. He was handed a mirror. What stared back was a stranger. Scars ran like fault lines across his abdomen. His left arm was twisted slightly from muscle loss. His jaw still ached when he chewed. The boy who'd stowed away to get into the war was gone. What stood in his place was someone older, harder, rebuilt with wire, bone, and sheer will. He didn't dwell on it. In typical Jack fashion, when someone asked him how he was doing, he just shrugged and said, "I'm vertical." But survival came with questions. Why had he lived? Why not the other Marines in his squad? Why didn't the grenades finish the job? He never had an answer. Some chalked it up to divine intervention, others to pure luck. One surgeon swore the soft volcanic ash had absorbed just enough of the blast to spare his spine. Maybe. Or maybe Jack Lucas was just too damn stubborn to die. What mattered was that he'd kept his word. He'd joined the fight, he'd protected his brothers, and he'd come out on the other side, torn, battered, but breathing. He wasn't done yet. In 1945, while the rest of the world was still celebrating victory, Jack Lucas was still recovering, physically, mentally, and in every other way a teenage grenade survivor might be. His war hadn't ended in Tokyo Bay. It had ended in a crater of volcanic ash, and his next battle was figuring out how to live after refusing to die. But word travels fast in the Marine Corps, especially when it involves the impossible. A 17-year-old Marine jumping on 2 grenades and living wasn't just a war story. It was a fable in the making, and Washington took notice. The paperwork had already begun moving up the chain of command back when Jack was still unconscious. Eyewitness reports were submitted, commanders corroborated the details, medical documentation proved the nature and extent of his wounds. There was no exaggeration, no hero inflation, just cold, hard facts. Jack had seen 2 grenades, thrown himself on top of them, and survived. It was enough. The Medal of Honor process usually took months, sometimes years. But in Jack's case, the story cut through the bureaucracy like a bayonet through canvas. By early 1946, he received official notice. He was to be awarded the highest military honor the United States could bestow. He was still 17 years old, the youngest American in the 20th century to receive it at all. The day of the ceremony, Jack stood on the White House lawn in full uniform, a little pale, still moving stiffly, but standing tall. His mother stood nearby. She had once written a letter asking the Marine Corps to send her underage son home. Now she watched as the President of the United States pinned a sky blue ribbon around his neck. President Harry S. Truman looked him in the eye, shook his hand firmly, and said, "You seem a little young to have done what you did." Jack smiled and replied, "I had to do it, sir." That was the kind of answer that stuck. Photographers snapped shots of the moment. Jack, still baby-faced, short-cropped hair, shoulders squared, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. The medal sat heavy against his chest, not in weight, but in meaning, because Jack knew what it stood for. It wasn't about glory, it wasn't about patriotism. It was about a split-second decision in a trench when he saw his brothers about to die and decided to take their place. In the weeks that followed, the press went wild. Newspapers called him the human shield, the teen who lived, the one-man miracle. He was interviewed, photographed, paraded at events. Radio shows wanted his voice. Veterans organizations sent invitations. The whole country wanted a piece of the teenage Marine who beat death. But Jack wasn't built for parades and sound bites. He endured the spotlight with a kind of amused detachment. He didn't give speeches. He didn't dress up the story. When asked what went through his mind in the moment, he usually said something like, "I didn't think at all, just reacted." If someone pushed for something more philosophical, he'd shrug. My buddies were in danger. What else was I going to do? That attitude baffled reporters, but it resonated deeply with other Marines. Jack wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be a Marine. And sometimes that meant diving on grenades without blinking. In the years that followed, the medal became both a blessing and a burden. It opened doors, but it also put a target on his back. People assumed he had all the answers, that he was some kind of moral compass. But Jack never claimed to be anything more than what he was, a kid who did what needed doing. He kept the medal, of course, polished it now and then, but he didn't flaunt it, didn't wear it to parties. Sometimes he even left it at home when attending formal events. The real award, he once said, was getting to walk away. One of the stories that stuck with people happened a few years later. Jack was going through an airport and the metal detector kept going off. Security stopped him and he calmly explained, "I've got about 200 pieces of shrapnel in me. That's your alarm." When they asked for proof, he pulled out his Medal of Honor. That was Jack. Direct, unapologetic, unimpressed by pomp. To him, the medal wasn't a reward, it was a reminder. A reminder of the day everything changed. Of the trench, the grenades, the silence after the blast, and the weight of living when he hadn't expected to. Years later, when young Marines asked him what it felt like to receive the medal, he'd say, "It's heavy, heavier than you think." And he wasn't talking about the ribbon. You'd think jumping on 2 grenades and living to talk about it would earn a guy a quiet life. Not Jack Lucas. He came home from the war in 1946, still 17, body riddled with metal, a Medal of Honor around his neck, and nothing resembling a plan. What do you do when you've already peaked before legal adulthood? When you've seen hell and made it back, but still can't legally buy a beer? The Marine Corps had made him into a legend, but it didn't give him a roadmap for civilian life. Jack tried college, briefly. He enrolled at High Point College in North Carolina, thinking maybe he'd get a degree, learn something new, start fresh. It didn't last. He couldn't sit still in classrooms, didn't take well to professors who'd never seen combat, and had zero patience for the peacetime mindset. He bounced from job to job, insurance salesman, construction, tried running his own business. Nothing stuck. Nothing felt like a mission. Nothing compared to the clarity of combat. And Jack wasn't just restless. He was angry. Angry at the world for moving on. Angry at the doctors who said he shouldn't be alive. Angry at the people who wanted him to smile and pose for pictures like everything was fine. He had nightmares, flashbacks, nights where he'd wake up screaming, covered in sweat, clawing at the shrapnel that never let him forget what happened. There was no word for it back then, no PTSD diagnosis, no support groups, just nerves or shell shock. And Jack didn't do therapy, he did fists. He got married, then divorced, then married again and again, 5 marriages in total. When asked about it later in life, he joked, "Survived 2 grenades, but not 5 wives." There was humor in it, but also truth. War had taught Jack how to survive. Peace had no such manual. But he wasn't done with the military. In the 1960s, more than a decade after surviving Iwo Jima, Jack Lucas walked into the U.S. Army recruiting office and enlisted. No fanfare, no speeches, just a man who missed the structure, the discipline, and maybe even the danger. They didn't know what to make of him at first. Here was a Medal of Honor recipient, older than most of the officers, requesting airborne school like it was a vacation. "Are you serious?" one recruiter asked. Jack just nodded. "Deadly." He passed the physical, barely. Metal fragments still showed up on the scans. His knees were shot, but he trained like a man half his age and made it through. The instructors didn't go easy on him. Jack didn't want them to. He completed jump school, earning his parachutist wings, and was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. In peacetime, he didn't see combat again, but that wasn't the point. The point was proving, again, that he could do what most men wouldn't even attempt. Until one jump almost killed him. Jack's chute malfunctioned during a training exercise. He plummeted through the air, slammed into another jumper mid-fall, and they both hit the ground in a tangled mess of nylon and limbs. The other man broke several bones. Jack just walked away, bruised, shaken, but alive. He laughed about it later. "Grenades didn't get me. Airplanes tried. I'm still here." Eventually he left the Army and returned to civilian life again. This time things settled, a little. He remarried. This one stuck. He found meaning in speaking to young Marines, visiting military bases, and telling his story, not to brag, but to remind them what brotherhood really meant. His message was always the same. The mission isn't glory, it's loyalty. It's the man next to you. Jack became a fixture at veteran events. He'd walk slowly, favoring his bad leg, but still held himself like a Marine. Medal or not, you knew when Jack Lucas entered a room. He didn't demand respect, he radiated it. He got involved with youth programs, ROTC groups, and veteran causes. Told his story in schools, never polished, never rehearsed, just the truth. Sometimes he'd pull kids aside and tell them, "If the time comes, you protect the people beside you. Don't wait for orders." He had a sense of humor about it all too. Once, during a public Q&A, a kid asked him if it hurt to jump on the grenades. Jack paused, scratched his jaw, and said, "Only the first one." By the 1990s, Jack had become more myth than man. Books were written, documentaries made, but he never bought into his own legend. He still carried shrapnel that set off metal detectors, still had nightmares, still walked with pain in his bones. He never claimed to be special, he just claimed to be a Marine. One who got lucky. One who didn't let fear make his decisions for him. Jack Lucas lived for 63 years after the day he was supposed to die. That alone is extraordinary. But he didn't just live, he endured, struggled, fought through pain, loved hard, failed often, and got back up every damn time. Because Jack Lucas wasn't invincible. He just refused to quit. By the early 1960s, most Medal of Honor recipients had long since retired into quiet lives. Businessmen, public speakers, community figures. Jack Lucas, he signed up for jump school. It wasn't a stunt, it wasn't nostalgia, it was just Jack being Jack. Civvy life didn't suit him. The world felt too slow, too soft. He missed the edge, missed the structure, missed being surrounded by men who understood that loyalty wasn't a slogan, it was a code. So at 33 years old, Jack Lucas, America's youngest Marine Medal of Honor recipient, walked into a U.S. Army recruiting station and re-enlisted. The recruiter reportedly laughed, thought it was a joke. Then Jack took off his shirt and dropped his paperwork on the desk. Dozens of surgical scars, a chest held together by stubbornness and scar tissue, a citation signed by President Truman. The recruiter stopped laughing. And just like that, Jack was back in uniform, only this time in the U.S. Army. He volunteered for airborne school at Fort Benning, Georgia, one of the toughest training programs in the military, even for the young, uninjured, and unburdened. Jack was none of those things, but he didn't care. Instructors gave him side-eye, whispered about his age, his injuries, his insanity, but when it came time to train, Jack outlasted guys half his age. He did the runs, the drills, the tower jumps. His body screamed, but he didn't complain. Didn't give them the satisfaction. He made it through ground week, then tower week, then came jump week. 5 qualifying jumps from a C-130 at 1,250 feet. The first few went as planned. Hard landings, bruised knees, bloodied elbows, but successful. Then came the fourth jump. Jack leapt from the plane into the open air. He reached for his ripcord. Nothing. No chute, not a partial deployment, not a tangled canopy. Nothing. Just air. Terminal velocity, seconds to impact. Instinct kicked in, training too. He twisted his body to spot the jumper above him, a younger soldier in the same stick. Jack maneuvered toward him in free fall, arms out, diving in reverse through the air. He collided with the man midair, hard enough to knock the wind from both of them. By sheer luck, Jack managed to grab onto the man's deployed chute lines. He wrapped himself up like a spider monkey on a lifeline, tangled in nylon, barely conscious. They hit the ground fast, too fast. The other jumper broke multiple bones. Jack rolled through the dirt like a thrown duffel bag and came to a stop, bleeding, bruised, but alive again. Medics sprinted over. One took his pulse, another started shouting for stretchers. Jack pushed them off, sat up slowly and said, "Don't worry, I've had worse." Of course he had. He was the man who jumped on 2 grenades. Compared to that, a 1,200-foot fall was just Tuesday. Word spread across the base in hours. The instructors couldn't believe it. They pulled his medical file, called higher command, ran out of explanations. A man with a torso held together by surgical wire had just survived a failed parachute deployment by mid-air tackling another human being. It shouldn't have worked. It should have killed both of them. But Jack Lucas didn't do should have. He spent a few days in the infirmary, got patched up, and returned to duty. He completed jump school, earned his wings, another badge to add to his uniform, another moment that turned into legend. By this point, Jack's reputation was something beyond myth. He was the guy who couldn't be killed, not by grenades, not by shrapnel, not by gravity. His fellow soldiers looked at him differently, not with fear, but with awe, like a man who'd cracked some cosmic code for staying alive. And Jack, he didn't milk it, he didn't brag. If anything, he brushed it off. "Should have checked my chute better," he'd say with a shrug. The story grew with time. Some versions had him riding the other guy all the way down like a surfboard. Others claimed he adjusted his fall mid-plunge, using only body weight. Jack never bothered correcting the details. He didn't care about the story. He cared that he walked away. Again. In a career defined with impossibilities, the parachute incident was just one more absurd footnote. But it said everything you needed to know about Jack Lucas. He wasn't lucky. He was relentless. Death had taken a shot, missed, took another shot, missed again. And Jack Lucas, he just got up, dusted off, and went back to work. By the 1980s, Jack Lucas had lived through more lives than most men could even imagine. 2 grenades, a failed parachute, 5 marriages, 21 surgeries, hundreds of speaking engagements, thousands of memories. What he hadn't done, what he never tried to do, was capitalize on any of it. There were offers, of course, publishers, agents, ghostwriters, producers waiting to turn his life into a movie. Jack shrugged them off. If they weren't going to get it right, he wasn't going to bother. He didn't want to be a product. He wanted to be a Marine. That meant showing up to VFW halls, shaking hands with teenagers in uniform, sitting on stage at military academies, not to lecture, but to remind the next generation what sacrifice actually looked like. He didn't glamorize war. He didn't wrap his story in flags or speeches. He told it plain. Grenades, blood, screams, pain, brotherhood, and survival. Always survival. He said it over and over again. You do what you have to do. You protect your buddies. That's the job. For young Marines, meeting Jack was like shaking hands with a ghost. Someone who had lived through the kind of story you hear about in whispered tones, but don't really believe until he's standing in front of you. He wasn't tall, didn't walk with a swagger, didn't wear his medal every day, but when he talked, rooms went quiet. There was something in his voice, gravel and steel. He didn't command attention, he just drew it. In his final years, Jack stayed busy. He worked with veterans organizations, spoke at schools, attended reunions, posed for photos when asked, always with that same tired grin and a straight back. He kept in touch with the Corps even decades after he'd left it. Marines never really leave, after all. The Corps was in his bones, and it loved him right back. They named buildings after him, schools, streets, VFW posts. At Parris Island, his name was mentioned during training as a standard, what it meant to go beyond the call of duty. Recruits were told, if Jack Lucas could jump on 2 grenades at 17, you can make it through boot camp. But Jack never let it go to his head. Honors were nice, ceremonies were fine, but what mattered to him was the next kid wearing boots too big and trying to live up to the uniform. He told them, you're not bulletproof. Don't try to be. Just be reliable. Be there when it counts. As he got older, the pain returned, stronger, deeper. The shrapnel had always been there, slowly shifting, grinding against bone, inflaming nerves. He joked about it. I rattle when I sneeze. But the truth was harsher. Every morning hurt, standing too long hurt, sleeping too little hurt. He lived a constant dull roar of discomfort that flared into agony on cold days. He never once asked for pity. Eventually, cancer came for him, leukemia. It moved slow at first, then faster. By the early 2000s, he was in and out of the hospital, still made appearances when he could, still refused to be defined by the disease. When asked how he was feeling, he'd say, still alive, that's the win. He died on June 5th, 2008 at the age of 80. Not in combat, not in free fall, not in a hospital ship on the edge of the Pacific, but in a bed, surrounded by family, quietly. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The funeral was attended by Marines young and old, generals, grunts, friends, strangers, people who'd never met him but felt like they knew him because his story had become part of theirs. As the rifles cracked in salute and taps played across the stone, a hush fell over the hill. They weren't just burying a man. They were burying a myth that had the good manners to be real. Jack's headstone is simple. Name, rank, service dates, Medal of Honor. It doesn't list the number of surgeries, or the weight of shrapnel, or the fact that he rewrote the definition of bravery before he was old enough to vote. It doesn't need to. Because every Marine who's ever read about Iwo Jima, who's heard the phrase, no greater love, who's ever thought, would I jump on the grenade, already knows. They know Jack Lucas. They know what he did. And they carry that story forward. Not in grand speeches or carved marble, but in whispered reminders before a patrol, in quiet moments during training, in the instinct to act when hesitation could mean death. That's legacy. Not just living long, but living well enough that your courage outlives your body. Jack Lucas didn't just survive history, he became part of it. Jack Lucas didn't plan to be a hero. He wasn't chasing medals, he wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing a rifle, a uniform, and a chance to fight. What made him different wasn't just that he lied about his age and forged a signature. It wasn't that he snuck aboard a troop ship bound for hell. It wasn't even that he jumped on 2 grenades and lived. What made Jack different was what came after. He didn't fold, didn't retreat into bitterness, didn't wave his Medal of Honor like a flag to open doors. He just lived, quietly, stubbornly, with the same steel spine that had made him a legend at 17. There are a lot of myths in Marine Corps history, stories told with half-truths and heavy polish. Jack Lucas isn't one of them. His story is absurd because it's real. His actions were suicidal, miraculous, selfless, and instinctive all at once. He didn't think, he dove. And that's why Marines still tell his story. Not because he was the youngest to ever earn the medal, not because he couldn't be killed, but because when the moment came, the real moment, when death was already midair and no one would have blamed him for running, Jack Lucas made a decision. He chose the grenade. He chose his brothers. And in doing so, he gave the rest of us a standard. The standard isn't bravery with an audience. It isn't sacrifice with a medal on the other end. The standard is what you do when no one would know, when no one would fault you for looking out for yourself. That's where heroism lives. Jack didn't talk about duty in poetic terms. He talked about it in the way a mechanic talks about a wrench, a thing you pick up when it's time to get the job done. And that's the lesson. If you wait for courage to feel good, you'll never act. If you wait until you're older, stronger, more ready, you'll miss your chance. Sometimes the moment finds you before you're ready. Jack was 15 when he joined the Marines, 17 when he threw himself on 2 grenades, 80 when he finally ran out of borrowed time, and eternal in the memory of every Marine who ever asked, would I have done the same? We tell Jack's story not just because it's unbelievable, but because it reminds us that some things, loyalty, courage, love for your brothers, are worth dying for, and sometimes even worth surviving. Semper Fi, Jack. You didn't just live through hell. You showed the rest of us how to walk through it with our heads held high. I appreciate you watching. Please consider subscribing. I'm Dave Newton. Until next time, stand tall.